She hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight in weeks. Her eyelids felt like sandpaper every time she blinked, and the dark circles under her eyes had become a permanent part of her face. Still, she pulled herself out of bed before sunrise, tiptoed past her mother's bedroom, careful not to wake her, and shuffled into the tiny kitchen of their one-bedroom apartment. The coffee maker sputtered to life, its familiar gurgle the only sound in the quiet morning. She leaned against the counter, arms wrapped around herself, watching steam curl from the pot like a ghost escaping. Life hadn't always been this heavy. Once she'd dreamed of becoming a nurse to help people, to make a difference. She remembered the pride she'd felt walking across the stage at graduation, diploma in hand, her mother clapping from the third row with tears in her eyes. Back then, everything seemed possible. But student loans piled up fast, and the reality of working at a struggling public hospital hit harder than she'd expected. St. Vincent's wasn't glamorous. The lights flickered in the East Wing. The elevators broke down at least twice a week, and sometimes they ran out of basic supplies like gauze or even clean scrubs. Yet she showed up, day after day, because someone had to be there for the patients who had no one else. Her shift started at 6 a.m. She gulped down the bitter coffee, grabbed her worn backpack, and stepped out into the Chicago chill. The bus ride was long and crowded, but she used the time to close her eyes and breathe. Not to sleep, just to exist without demands for a few minutes. At the hospital, she changed quickly in the dim locker room, pulling on her scrubs and tying her hair back. Her name tag read nurse and nothing more. No fancy credentials, no special title, just nurse, and that was enough. The day unfolded like most others. A diabetic patient needing insulin, an elderly man confused and calling for his long-dead wife, a young mother in labor with no family to support her. She held hands, checked vitals, updated charts, and smiled, even when she felt like crumbling. By lunchtime, her feet ached, and her lower back throbbed from lifting a patient who'd fallen. She sat in the break room with a sad-looking sandwich and a bottle of water, scrolling through her phone. A reminder popped up. Mom's medication refill due tomorrow. She sighed. Another bill, another thing to juggle. After her shift ended at 2 p.m., she didn't go home. Instead, she walked 10 blocks to the Oakwood Senior Center. She'd started volunteering there 6 months ago, mostly because she couldn't stand the thought of her mom being alone all day. And maybe, just maybe, because she needed to feel useful beyond the hospital walls. The center was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. Residents sat in clusters, some playing cards, others dozing in armchairs by the window. That's where she first saw him. He sat alone near the back, a thin man with silver hair combed neatly to the side, wearing a faded brown sweater and reading glasses perched low on his nose. In his hands was a worn copy of poetry. Robert Frost, she'd later learn. He didn't talk much, just nodded politely when she passed by. But one rainy Tuesday, when the center was nearly empty and the storm outside howled like a lost animal, he looked up as she was wiping down tables. "Do you like poetry?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. She paused, rag in hand. "I haven't read much since school." He smiled, a small, gentle thing. Frost wrote about roads not taken, about choices, about quiet courage. He held out the book. "Would you like to hear a poem?" She hesitated, then pulled up a chair. He read, stopping by woods on a snowy evening, his voice steady, unhurried. When he finished, there was a silence that didn't feel empty, but full, like the air itself was listening. She didn't know why, but something in his calm presence made her feel seen, not as a nurse or a daughter or a bill payer, but just as a person. After that, she started sitting with him during her volunteer hour. His name was Daniel. He came every Tuesday and Thursday, always alone. He never talked about his past, but he asked about hers. He listened, really listened, when she spoke about her mom's worsening arthritis, or how hard it was to watch patients suffer when the system failed them. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes, just quiet understanding. One evening, as she helped him into his old coat, he moved slower these days, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. He said, "You carry so much, don't you?" She blinked, surprised. "I guess we all do." "But you carry it for others too," he said gently. That's rare. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever put it like that. Weeks passed. Their conversations grew longer. Sometimes, after her shift, she'd walk him to the bus stop 3 blocks away, even though it made her later getting home. He never asked for help, but she offered anyway. One night he invited her for tea at his place, just around the corner, he said. She almost declined, but something in his eyes made her say yes. His house was modest, a small brick bungalow with a tidy front yard and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. Inside it was warm and lived in, shelves lined with books, framed black and white photos on the walls, a well-loved armchair by the fireplace. No luxury, no flash, just peace. He made tea in mismatched mugs and served it with shortbread cookies he claimed his late wife used to bake. He spoke of her for the first time that night. How she'd loved gardening, how she'd laughed at bad jokes, how she'd held his hand through every storm until her last breath 2 years ago. His voice cracked only once, and he quickly cleared his throat, looking out the window. I miss her every day, he said simply. But talking about her, it keeps her close. She sat quietly, letting him grieve in his own time, and when she finally left, he pressed a small jar of homemade jam into her hands. For your mother, he said. Strawberry. From last summer's garden. She walked home in the cool night air, the jar cradled in her arms like something precious. For the first time in months, she didn't feel so alone. Their friendship deepened slowly, naturally. She began stopping by after work more often, not out of obligation, but because his quiet home felt like a sanctuary. He'd ask about her day, and she'd tell him about the little victories. A patient who finally smiled, a child who stopped crying when she sang a lullaby, a colleague who brought her coffee when she looked exhausted. He'd nod, sometimes offer a thoughtful comment, but mostly he just let her be. He never asked for anything in return, never complained about his own aches or loneliness, though she saw them in the way he sometimes stared at his wedding ring or how he'd pause mid-sentence, lost in memory. But whenever she was there, he seemed lighter, like her presence reminded him that life wasn't over yet. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, he turned to her and said, You've brought light back into this old house, she smiled. It was already here. I just noticed it. He didn't reply right away. Then softly, Would you consider staying? She looked at him, confused. Staying? Not just visiting, he said, choosing his words carefully. Living here with me, not as a nurse or a helper, but as someone who shares this life. However much of it I have left. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected this. She looked into his eyes, kind, tired, hopeful, and saw no hidden agenda, no pressure. Just a lonely man offering his heart, fragile as it was. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say yes, he said quickly. And you don't have to say no. Just think about it. There's no rush. She went home that night with her mind spinning. She thought about her tiny apartment, the constant stress, the bills piling up. She thought about her mother, who'd been urging her to find someone who sees your soul, not just your strength. And she thought about Daniel, his quiet strength, his gentle way, the way he made her feel like she mattered. Just as she was, a week later, she knocked on his door with a suitcase in hand. I've thought about it, she said. He opened the door wide, eyes bright. And she stepped inside. I'm staying. He didn't hug her, too proper for that, but his smile said everything. That night they ate soup at the kitchen table, the same way they always did. Only now her coat hung on the hook by the door, and her toothbrush sat beside his in the bathroom. She still worked at the hospital. Still worried about her mom. Still carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. But now, at the end of the day, there was a warm house waiting, a cup of tea, a quiet voice that said, Tell me about your day. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. She never asked about his past. Never wondered how he afforded the house or why he lived so simply. To her, he was just Daniel, a retired man who loved poetry, made terrible coffee, and remembered to water the plants on Sundays. She assumed he'd been a teacher, maybe, or a librarian, something quiet like him. She didn't know that the name Hartwell was etched in gold on the lobby of half the major hospitals in the country. She didn't know that the very institution where she worked, St. Vincent's, was technically part of a network he'd built from the ground up decades ago. She didn't know that the man who handed her a jar of jam had once negotiated billion-dollar deals before breakfast. All she knew was that he treated her with kindness, that he listened, that he made her feel like she was enough, exactly as she was. And in a world that constantly demanded more, that was everything. Life settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both quietly cherished. Mornings began with the soft clink of mugs, the smell of weak coffee, Daniel never could get it strong enough, and the rustle of newspaper pages. She'd rush out the door by 5:30 a.m., lunch packed in a faded cloth bag, hair still damp from a hurried shower. He'd wave from the porch, wrapped in his old cardigan even in summer, and call out, "Be kind to yourself today, too." She didn't understand it at first, that phrase. She'd always thought kindness was something you gave others, not something you owed yourself. But over time, she began to see what he meant. On days when her hands shook from exhaustion, she'd allow herself 5 extra minutes in the break room. When a patient yelled at her out of fear or pain, she'd take a breath before responding, small acts of grace for herself as much as for others. And every evening, no matter how late, she'd come home to a lit porch light and a warm plate covered in foil on the stove. Their home wasn't fancy. The couch sagged in the middle. The fridge hummed louder than it should, and the bathroom faucet dripped no matter how many times he tightened it. But it felt like theirs. She hung her nursing cap on a hook by the door. He kept a small vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table, picked from the empty lot down the street, because he remembered her once saying she missed having fresh flowers around. They never talked about money. He paid the bills without fanfare, always leaving the envelopes unopened on the counter for her to see as if to say, "This is shared." She insisted on contributing what she could from her paycheck, and he never refused, just tucked her cash into the same tin where he kept spare change and grocery lists. It felt honest, equal, real. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat side by side on the porch swing, watching sparrows argue over crumbs, he turned to her and said, "I've been thinking." She looked up from her book. "About?" He took a slow breath, fingers resting on his cane. "About us. About time." She waited, not pushing. "I'm not getting younger," he said gently, "and I don't want to waste what's left pretending I'm just your roommate or your friend." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this last night. Read it when you're ready. No rush. No pressure." She took the paper, heart thudding oddly in her chest. That night after he'd gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table under the dim lamp and unfolded it. "You walked into my life when I thought the light had gone out for good. You didn't fix me. You reminded me I was still here. I don't have much time left, but I'd be honored to spend whatever remains with you. Not as a caretaker, not as a guest, but as my wife. If you'll have me." Tears blurred the words. She read it 3 times. Not once did he mention love in the grand, sweeping way people do in movies, but every sentence was full of it. Quiet, steady, real. The next morning, over burnt toast and watery tea, she handed the note back to him. "Yes," she said simply. He blinked. "Just like that?" "You asked me to share your days," she said. "I already am." They married 3 weeks later at the county courthouse on a gray Tuesday morning. No guests, no flowers, no white dress. She wore her best sweater, the one with the tiny blue flowers her mother had knitted, and he wore a clean button-down shirt and the same brown shoes he'd worn for years. The clerk smiled as they signed the papers, and afterward they stopped at the diner down the street for pancakes. "You're my wife now," he said, sliding the syrup toward her. She grinned. "And you're stuck with me. Back home nothing changed, except everything did." She still worked double shifts. He still read poetry in the evenings. But now when she came home bone-tired, he'd say, "My wife," like it was the most natural, wonderful thing in the world. And when he coughed in the night, a dry, rattling sound that worried her more each time, she'd sit beside him, hand on his back, whispering, "I've got you." She never questioned his past. Never wondered why a man who seemed so ordinary lived in a house that, while modest, sat in a quiet neighborhood where even the smallest homes cost more than she'd ever imagined. She assumed he'd saved carefully, maybe inherited something from family. It didn't matter. What mattered was how he looked at her when she walked into a room, like she'd brought the sun with her. One evening, as she sorted laundry, she found an old photo tucked in the pocket of his winter coat. It showed a much younger him standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a wide smile, in front of a building with tall glass windows and a sign that read, Hartwell Memorial Hospital. She studied it for a moment, then slipped it back. Maybe he'd been a hospital administrator once. It made sense. He always asked thoughtful questions about her work, knew medical terms she hadn't expected, and once corrected a doctor's dosage suggestion during a phone call with calm authority. But she'd just assumed it was from years of caring for his late wife through illness. She never dug deeper. never snooped through drawers or asked about old colleagues. Trust to her wasn't something you proved, it was something you lived. Their days filled with small rituals. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where he'd haggle good-naturedly over tomatoes and she'd sneak samples of cheese. Sunday dinners with her mother, who'd grown fond of him, calling him that sweet man with the gentle hands. He always brought soup for her mom, always asked about her pain levels, always remembered to adjust the chair so her feet were elevated. One rainy November night, after a particularly hard shift, 2 patients lost, one family screaming at her for things beyond her control, she came home and just stood in the doorway soaked and shaking. He didn't say a word, just took her coat, wrapped her in a dry towel and led her to the couch. Then he brought her tea, turned on the old record player, soft jazz, the kind her mother used to love, and sat beside her, not touching, just being there. After a long silence, she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." He didn't offer empty comfort, didn't say it'll get better. Instead, he said, "You don't have to carry it all. Not alone." And in that moment, she believed him. Weeks turned into months. Winter came, then thawed into a hesitant spring. His health wavered. Some days strong, others spent mostly in bed. She adjusted her schedule when she could, took on fewer overtime hours, and hired a part-time aide for her mother so she could be home more. He hated the idea at first. "You're not my nurse," he'd insist, but she'd just smile and say, "No, I'm your wife." And wives worry, he'd grumble. But his eyes would soften. One afternoon, while cleaning out the hall closet, she found a box labeled Margaret, 1978. Inside were letters, dried flowers, and a small velvet box. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. Inside was a simple gold band, slightly worn. She stared at it, heart aching for the love they must have shared. She put it back carefully, but that night she asked him about Margaret. He was quiet for a long time. "Then she was my compass," he said. Smart, stubborn, full of fire. She wanted to be a doctor, but back then, it wasn't easy for women, so she became a nurse instead. "Best one I ever knew." He smiled faintly. She used to say hospitals should feel like homes, not factories. I never forgot that. She reached for his hand. "She'd like you now." "I hope so," he said softly. "I try to live in a way that would make her proud." That conversation changed something between them. It wasn't just companionship anymore, it was legacy. She began to see his quiet choices not as eccentricities, but as acts of remembrance. The way he insisted on fresh linens for guests. The way he always asked nurses their names at doctor's appointments. The way he treated every person, cashier, janitor, doctor, with the same respect. She loved him more for it. One day while grocery shopping, a woman stopped her in the cereal aisle. "You're married to Daniel Hartwell, aren't you?" She froze. "Yes?" The woman's eyes widened. "Oh my goodness. I used to work at Hartwell General. He built that place from nothing. Do you know how many lives he saved through that network?" She stared, confused. "Hartwell General. I thought he was a teacher," the woman laughed. "A teacher? Honey, he's one of the richest men in healthcare. Or he was. Rumor says he walked away from it all after his wife died." She left the store with her cart half full, heart racing. That night, she asked him gently, "Were you involved in hospitals before you retired?" He stirred his tea, not looking up. "I helped start a few, just a few." He met her eyes. "Does it change anything?" She thought about it. "No," she said honestly. "But I'd like to understand." He nodded. "After Margaret passed, I couldn't stand the boardrooms, the profit reports, the way care became a number. So I stepped back, sold most of my shares. Kept enough to live simply, give quietly. I didn't lie to you, I just didn't lead with that part of my life. Because I wanted you to see me, not the name, not the money, just me." She believed him. Because everything he'd done since they met had been consistent, humble, kind, present. If he'd wanted to impress her, he could have. But he chose tea on the porch instead. Still, the knowledge settled in her mind like a stone in a pond, ripples spreading slowly. She started noticing things. The quality of the wood in his desk, the way his old watch still gleamed, the fact that his retirement savings seemed to cover everything without strain. But she never let it color how she treated him. He was still the man who burned toast, forgot to take his pills, and cried quietly when old songs came on the radio. Their love wasn't built on secrets, but on what they chose to share. And he'd shared his heart, His grief, his hopes, his quiet daily acts of care. That was enough. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies return for summer, he took her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For saying yes. For staying. For seeing me." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saw me first." And in that simple exchange, in the creak of the swing and the hum of crickets, they found everything they needed, not in grand gestures or hidden fortunes, but in the ordinary magic of choosing each other, day after day, in a world that rarely made room for quiet love. She still went to work at St. Vincent's, still worried about her mother, still carried the weight of her patient's pain. But now when she came home, she wasn't just coming to a house, she was coming home to a promise, kept not with words, but with warm soup, folded laundry, and a hand that always reached for hers in the dark. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, drizzly day that made the hospital feel even more tired than usual. She walked in to find a cluster of nurses huddled near the break room, voices low and tense. One of them turned, eyes red-rimmed. "They're closing St. Vincent's," she whispered. End of the month. She thought it was a joke at first. But then she saw the official memo taped to the bulletin board. Cold, impersonal, final. Due to ongoing financial insolvency, St. Vincent's Community Hospital will cease all operations effective June 30th. No warning. No plan for patients. No regard for the staff who'd poured their lives into those worn hallways. Her stomach dropped like a stone. This wasn't just a workplace. It was where she'd held the hand of a scared teenager giving birth alone, where she'd sat with an old man as he took his last breath, where she'd learned that healing wasn't always about curing but about being there, and now it was just gone, like it never mattered. She made it through her shift on autopilot, moving through routines without feeling them. When she got home, she didn't even take off her shoes. She just sat at the kitchen table, head in her hands, and cried, quiet, exhausted tears that had been building for years. He found her like that. He didn't say anything at first. Just poured her a glass of water, set it down gently, and sat across from her. After a long silence, she told him everything. The closure, the panic among her coworkers, the patients with nowhere to go, the fear of losing her job in a city where nursing positions were already scarce. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His skin was thin, his knuckles swollen with age, but his grip was steady. "That's not right," he said simply. "It's not fair," she choked out. "People depend on that place. Not everyone can afford fancy clinics or drive across town for care." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant as if seeing something far away. "No," he said. "It's not fair at all." For the next few days, he was quieter than usual. He still made tea, still asked about her day, but there was a new weight in his silence. She assumed he was just grieving with her, another loss in a life already full of them. She didn't know he was making phone calls late at night, speaking in hushed tones she couldn't hear through the bedroom wall. She didn't see the stack of documents that appeared briefly on his desk before he tucked them away. Then, one morning her phone buzzed with a news alert. She almost ignored it. She'd sworn off the news after the hospital announcement, but something made her open it. Mystery donor saves St. Vincent's, historic community hospital to reopen under new ownership. Her breath caught. She read it again, and again. The article said an anonymous benefactor had purchased the hospital outright, canceled the closure and pledged full modernization, new equipment, staff retention bonuses, expanded services for low-income patients. The only condition? The facility would remain a community-focused hospital, never turning away patients due to inability to pay. Her heart hammered. She showed the article to him over breakfast. He read it slowly, then folded the paper and set it aside. "That's good news," he said, voice calm. "Who would do something like that?" She asked, eyes searching his face. He met her gaze. "Someone who believes care shouldn't be a privilege." She felt a flicker of unease, but pushed it away. It couldn't be him. He was retired. He lived simply. He barely used a computer, and yet, something in his tone felt off. Too measured. Too familiar. That afternoon, she went to the hospital for a staff meeting. The mood had shifted completely. Hopeful, buzzing, almost giddy. Posters were already going up. St. Vincent's Lives. Someone had brought cupcakes. But as she walked down the hall, She overheard two administrators talking near the old supply closet. "Can't believe Hartwell himself showed up," one said, "after all these years. Yeah, I heard he's been living like a hermit. Guess he finally remembered where his money came from." Her blood ran cold. Hartwell, the name from the photo, the name from the grocery store rumor, the name on half the hospitals in the state. She stood frozen, the cupcake in her hand suddenly heavy. It couldn't be, not him, not her quiet, poetry-reading husband who wore the same sweater for 3 days straight. But that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, paint the sky in streaks of orange and purple, she couldn't stay silent. "Was it you?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't pretend not to understand. He just looked at her, his eyes tired but clear. "Yes." She stared at him, emotions crashing like waves. Relief, betrayal, confusion, anger. "All this time, you knew I worked there? You knew how much it meant to me?" "I didn't know when we met," he said gently. "But I found out soon after. And I saw how much you loved it, how much you gave to it. When I heard it was closing, I couldn't let it happen. But why didn't you tell me?" Her voice cracked. "Why let me think you were just a retired teacher? Why let me struggle? Why let me cry in front of you like I had nothing?" He flinched as if her words stung. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd see the money, not the man. Afraid you'd stay out of pity or obligation, or worse, because you thought it would solve your problems." He looked down at his hands. "I've had people love the idea of me, the name, the fortune, but never just me, not since Margaret. When you came into my life, you saw a lonely old man who liked poetry and burned toast. And you stayed anyway. That meant more than any amount of money ever could." She turned away, tears welling. It made sense. Horribly, painfully, it made sense. He hadn't lied. He'd just let her believe a simpler version of the truth. And maybe, in his own way, he'd been protecting something precious. The chance to be loved for who he was, not what he owned. But it still hurt. Because she'd carried her burdens alone, thinking there was no other way, never knowing the man beside her could have lifted them with a phone call. They sat in silence for a long time. Crickets began their evening song. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Finally she spoke again, voice steadier now. "You saved the hospital," she said. "That's incredible. And I'm grateful, truly, but you should have told me." "I know," he said softly. "And I'm sorry. The next few days were strange. At the hospital, everyone treated her differently. Some smiled warmly as if she were a hero. Others shot her sideways glances, whispering behind their hands. She heard the rumors. She married him for the money. She manipulated him into saving the place. She's just using him." It stung, but she held her head high. She hadn't asked for any of this. At home, things were quieter. They still shared meals, still talked, but there was a new distance, a carefulness in how they spoke, like walking on thin ice. She kept waiting for him to offer her something grand, a fancy car, a new house, a position in the hospital's new leadership. But he didn't. He just kept making tea, kept asking how her day was, kept leaving little notes in her lunch bag. "You matter. You always have." Then came the press conference. The hospital invited all staff to attend. She almost didn't go, but curiosity and a need to see this through pulled her there. She stood in the back of the crowded room, arms crossed, as the new CEO stepped to the podium. "And now," the CEO said, smiling broadly, "we are honored to introduce the visionary behind this renewal, Mr. Daniel Hartwell." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. And there he was, her husband, walking slowly to the stage with his cane, dressed in a suit she'd never seen before, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked older, frailer, but also different, more commanding, more like the man the world knew. He spoke briefly, about community, about dignity and care, about honoring the nurses and staff who kept St. Vincent's alive when no one else would. He didn't mention her, not once, and she was glad. She didn't want to be part of the story, but after the event, as she turned to leave, a reporter spotted her. "You're his wife, aren't you? What do you think about all this?" She froze. "I think it's about time someone remembered that healthcare is about people, not profits." The reporter blinked, then scribbled furiously. That night, she confronted him again, not with anger but with clarity. "You didn't have to hide from me," she said. I wouldn't have loved you less if I'd known. Maybe I would have understood you better. He looked at her, eyes glistening. Maybe, but I needed to be sure. Not for you, for me. I needed to know I was still capable of being loved for myself. She sighed, the fight draining out of her. You were always enough just as you were. He reached for her hand. And you still are. Money didn't change that. It never will. In the days that followed, the truth settled between them like dust after a storm. Still there, but no longer choking. She returned to work, not as the billionaire's wife, but as the same nurse who checked blood pressure and held hands. And he? He started visiting the hospital not as an owner, but as a volunteer, reading poetry to patients in the rehab wing, just like he used to at the senior center. One afternoon, she found him sitting with an elderly woman who hadn't spoken in days. He was reading The Road Not Taken, his voice soft and steady. The woman's fingers twitched, then slowly reached for his hand. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks. Later, as they walked home together, she slipped her arm through his. You didn't need billions to do that, she said. No, he agreed. Just a little time and a little heart. And in that moment she realized something. The real miracle wasn't that he'd saved the hospital. It was that, despite everything, the secrets, the shock, the weight of his past, they were still choosing each other. Not for what they could give, but for who they were. That was worth more than any fortune. The days after the truth came out felt like walking through fog, everything familiar, but nothing quite the same. She still put on her scrubs every morning, still clocked in at the hospital, still checked vitals and changed IV bags. But now when she passed a group of nurses in the hallway, their laughter would sometimes stop mid-sentence. When she sat in the break room, conversations grew quieter. She heard the whispers, even when they thought she couldn't. Lucky she married into that. Bet she knew all along. Now she's got it made. No more double shifts for her. It stung more than she expected. Not because it was true, she hadn't known and she still worked just as hard, but because it painted her as someone she wasn't. Someone who used people. Someone who played a part just to get ahead. And worst of all, it made her feel like she'd lost the one thing she'd always been proud of. Her integrity. At home, things were different too. He tried in his quiet way to give her space. He didn't push. Didn't offer grand gestures, but she could see the worry in his eyes. The fear that he'd broken something between them that couldn't be fixed. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at a stack of bills, he placed a cup of tea in front of her. Not her usual chamomile, this was peppermint, her favorite when she was stressed. She hadn't even told him she was stressed. I've been thinking, he said, sitting across from her. The hospital's reopening in 3 months. They're rebuilding everything. New wings, updated systems, better staffing ratios. But they're missing something, she looked up. What's that? Someone who knows what it's really like on the floor. Someone who's held a patient's hand when the machines beeped too loud. Someone who's cried in the supply closet after losing someone they couldn't save. He paused. I've asked the board to create a new role, Director of Patient Experience. And I'd like you to take it, she blinked. Me? I'm just a nurse. You're more than that, he said gently. You see people, not cases. You understand that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about dignity, respect, kindness. That's what St. Vincent's needs. Not more profit margins. More heart. She shook her head. I don't want a handout. I don't want people thinking I got the job because of you. I'm not offering you a handout, he said firmly. I'm offering you a seat at the table, but only if you agree to one condition. What's that? You design it your way. No corporate jargon. No empty promises. If you say nurses need more break time, they get it. If you say the waiting room needs toys for kids, it gets them. If you say we should hire more interpreters so no one feels lost in a foreign language, that happens. Your voice, your values, that's the only way I'll support it. She stared at him, surprised. This wasn't about power or image. It was about trust. About giving her real influence, not as his wife, but as the person who'd lived the reality he'd only read about in reports. After a long silence, she said, Only if you promise not to interfere. Even when you think I'm wrong. A small smile touched his lips. Deal. The next week, she met with the hospital's leadership team. They were polished, professional, used to speaking in acronyms and quarterly projections. At first, they treated her like a token, the human face of the new initiative. But she didn't play along. She brought photos, a child sleeping on a gurney because there were no beds, an elderly man eating cold soup because dietary forgot his order, a nurse sitting on the floor exhausted, during her only break. "This is what we're fixing," she said. "Not the paint on the walls, the people inside them." Slowly, they started listening. She proposed things no one had considered. Quiet rooms for grieving families, flexible scheduling so single parents could pick up their kids, mental health support for staff. She insisted that every new policy be tested by actual nurses before it was approved. And to everyone's surprise, even her own, her ideas stuck. But the real test came when the board suggested renaming the hospital. Hartwell Community Care Center, they proposed, with sleek logos and marketing plans ready to go. She stood up in the meeting. No. All eyes turned to her. "This place was St. Vincent's long before any of us got here," she said. "It stood for something. Care for the forgotten, help for the helpless. If we erase that name, we erase its soul. Keep St. Vincent's. Add in partnership with Hartwell if you must. But don't pretend this is a new beginning. It's a continuation." There was silence. Then, from the back of the room, he nodded once. The board agreed. As the weeks passed, something shifted, not just in the hospital, but between them. She stopped waiting for him to fix things for her. Instead, she brought him problems and asked for his perspective, not his wallet. And he, in turn, stopped shielding her from the world. He let her fight her own battles, only stepping in when she asked. One Saturday morning, they drove to the old neighborhood where she'd grown up. The buildings were worn, the sidewalks cracked, but the bakery on the corner still made the same cinnamon rolls her mother loved. They bought two and sat on a bench in the tiny park across the street. "I used to walk here with my mom when I was little," she said, watching kids chase pigeons. She'd point to the hospital on the hill and say, "One day you'll help people there." I didn't know then how hard it would be, or how much it would cost me. He didn't offer empty comfort, just said, "You still do." Every day she looked at him, really looked. The lines on his face, the tremor in his hands, the quiet strength in his eyes. This wasn't the billionaire the world saw. This was the man who remembered how she took her tea, who saved the comics page for her each Sunday, who cried when she sang off-key in the shower. "I was angry," she admitted, "not because you had money, but because you didn't trust me enough to tell me." He sighed. "I trusted you. I just didn't trust myself. After losing Margaret, I thought the best I could do was disappear. But you pulled me back into the world, and I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you'd let go." "I wouldn't have," she said softly, "because I didn't fall in love with a teacher or a billionaire. I fell in love with the man who reads poetry to strangers and waters my mother's plants when I'm working late." He reached for her hand. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but his touch was sure. Back at the hospital, the changes began to show. Nurses smiled more. Patients stayed longer in the new family lounges. Volunteers signed up in droves. And when the local news came to do a feature on the rebirth of St. Vincent's, they didn't focus on the money or the name. They focused on the people, the nurse who started a literacy program for kids, the janitor who learned every patient's name, the retired man who read poems every Thursday afternoon. She watched the segment at home, curled up on the couch beside him. When it ended, he turned to her. "You did that." "No," she said. "We did." The word "we" hung in the air, warm and real. Not as owner and employee, not as rich man and struggling nurse, but as partners. One evening, as she sorted through mail, she found an envelope addressed to her, not the hospital, not him, just her. Inside was a letter from a former patient, a young woman who'd given birth alone at St. Vincent's during its darkest days. "You held my hand when I was scared," it read. "You told me I was strong. I named my daughter after you. Thank you for seeing me." She showed it to him. He read it slowly, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "That's why we do this," he said. "Not for headlines. For moments like that." She tucked the letter into her nightstand drawer, the same one where she kept his first note, the one that asked her to stay. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, days when the weight of responsibility pressed down, days when old rumors flared up, days when his health worried her more than she let on. But now they faced them together, not as savior and saved, but as two people choosing each other, again and again, and in the quiet moments, making dinner, walking in the rain, sitting in comfortable silence, they found something rare, a love that didn't need grand stages or hidden fortunes. Just honesty, humility, and the courage to keep showing up exactly as they were. The morning of the reopening was bright and crisp, the kind of autumn day that smells like fallen leaves and fresh beginnings. She stood at the edge of the crowd gathered outside the hospital entrance, arms crossed, heart pounding, not from nerves, but from something deeper, pride maybe, or awe. The old brick building still stood, but everything else had changed. New windows let in more light. A ramp now led smoothly to the front doors. A small garden bloomed near the entrance with benches and shade trees. And above it all, a new sign, St. Vincent's Community Care Center, a Hartwell initiative. But the real magic wasn't in the paint or the landscaping. It was inside. She'd spent months working with architects, nurses, social workers, even former patients to design a space that felt less like an institution and more like a home. The waiting room had soft chairs, books for all ages, and a play corner with toys that didn't squeak. The staff break room had real windows, a fridge stocked with healthy snacks, and her personal victory, a nap pod for exhausted night shift workers. Every hallway had natural light. Every exam room had space for a family member to sit close. And in the heart of it all, on the third floor was the Margaret Hartwell wing, named not for show, but in quiet honor of the woman who'd believed healthcare should be kind long before it was trendy. She hadn't planned to speak at the ceremony. She'd told the organizers she preferred to stay in the background. But as the crowd grew, neighbors, former patients, city officials, even a few reporters, she felt a nudge at her elbow. He stood beside her, dressed in his best suit, leaning lightly on his cane, eyes bright. "They asked for you," he said softly. "Not me, you." She shook her head. "I don't do speeches." "You don't have to give a speech," he said. "Just tell them what this place means." She took a breath, walked to the small podium, looked out at the faces, some she knew, some she didn't. And she spoke not from notes but from her heart. "This hospital saved me before I ever worked here," she began, voice steady. "When I was a kid, my mom broke her leg and couldn't afford a doctor. St. Vincent's treated her anyway. They gave her crutches, pain medicine, even rides home. They didn't ask for money. They asked, 'What do you need?'" She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "For years I thought that kind of care was rare. But being here taught me it's not rare. It's just been buried under paperwork and profits. What we've done isn't about new machines or fancy titles. It's about remembering that every person who walks through these doors is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who deserves to be seen." She didn't mention him, didn't thank the donors or the board. She talked about the nurse who stayed late to comfort a scared teenager, the janitor who learned Spanish so he could talk to patients, the volunteer who brought homemade soup every Tuesday. "This place belongs to all of us," she said, "and we'll keep it that way." Applause rose, not the polite kind, but the warm, heartfelt kind that starts in the chest and spills out. She stepped down, relieved, and found him waiting with a small smile. "You were brilliant," he whispered. "I just told the truth," she said. Later that day, as the crowd thinned and the ribbon-cutting photos were packed away, they walked through the hospital together, just the two of them. No cameras, no speeches, just quiet footsteps on clean floors. In the new family lounge, a young mother rocked her baby, tears in her eyes as she whispered, "It's so peaceful here." In the rehab wing, an elderly man practiced walking with a therapist, laughing when he nearly tripped. In the garden courtyard, two teenagers sat with a counselor, talking softly under the trees. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" she asked him. He looked around, eyes glistening. "Not just me. Her too." He touched the lapel of his coat, where a small photo of his late wife was tucked inside. She always said hospitals should heal the soul, not just the body. They stopped by the new nurses' station on the east wing, her old post. A young nurse she'd trained looked up and grinned. "Everything's running smooth," she said. "And the new scheduling system?" "Lifesaver," she smiled. "Good, keep speaking up. That's how it stays that way." As they stepped outside, the sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows. He slowed his pace, breathing a little heavier than usual. She matched his rhythm without a word. That evening, they didn't go to a fancy dinner or attend a gala. They went home. He made soup, his famous vegetable stew, and she set the table with their mismatched plates. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after years of knowing someone's rhythms, their sighs, their quiet joys. After dinner, she washed the dishes while he sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket. She joined him, tucking her feet under her, watching the fireflies blink on and off in the gathering dusk. "They're calling it a miracle," she said softly. "The way this place came back." He shook his head. "It's not a miracle. It's just people choosing to care." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You could have bought a dozen hospitals, built something shiny and perfect. But you chose this one. Why?" He was quiet for a long time. "Then because this is where you are. And where you are is home." She closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because she wanted to hold on to this moment. The cool air, the creak of the swing, the weight of his arm around her shoulders. No titles, no headlines. Just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of grief and exhaustion and built something real. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new kind of normal. She still worked at the hospital, but now her days were split between the floor and meetings, always pushing for more humanity in the system. He rarely came to official events, but every Thursday, like clockwork, he showed up with his poetry book and a thermos of tea, reading to anyone who'd listen in the Margaret wing. They also started something new, a small foundation in his late wife's name. Not a big, flashy charity, but a quiet effort to support widows struggling with medical bills and nurses pursuing further education. They didn't hold galas. They just wrote checks, sent care packages, and visited the people they helped, always without fanfare. One afternoon, as they sorted applications at the kitchen table, she came across a letter from a woman in rural Iowa. Her husband had died suddenly, leaving her with 3 kids and a mountain of hospital debt. She'd been working 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up. "I just want to give my children a chance," she wrote. "That's all." She showed it to him. Without a word, he wrote a check large enough to clear the debt and cover a year of childcare. Then he folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Why do you keep them?" she asked. "Because they remind me why we do this," he said. "Not for recognition. For relief," she nodded. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? Not grand gestures, but quiet acts that let someone breathe again. Their home remained unchanged. Same creaky floors, same old couch, same porch swing that groaned with every breeze. Reporters sometimes asked for interviews, but they always declined. "Our story isn't about us," she'd say. "It's about what's possible when kindness wins." And slowly the rumors faded. The nurses who once whispered now greeted her with genuine warmth. The community saw her not as a lucky wife, but as a leader who'd fought for them. And he? He was just that sweet man who reads poems, the same as he'd always been. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under a full moon, he turned to her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met?" She thought about it. "I'd still be working double shifts, probably drowning in bills. You'd be alone in this house reading Frost to the Walls." He smiled faintly. "I'd have missed you." "I'd have missed me too," she said, half joking. But it was true. Being with him had reminded her of her own worth, not as a nurse, not as a daughter, but as a person who deserved love just for showing up. He reached for her hand. His skin was thinner now, his grip weaker, but his presence was as steady as ever. "You gave me a reason to come back," he said, "to care again. And you gave me a reason to believe that love doesn't have to be loud to be real." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the water lap against the shore, the distant call of a loon, the rustle of leaves in the wind. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises, just the quiet certainty that they'd found something rare, not because of money or fate, but because they'd chosen each other, day after ordinary day. Later that night, as she brushed her teeth, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The dark circles were still there. The lines around her eyes had deepened. But for the first time in years, she didn't see exhaustion. She saw peace, and when she climbed into bed beside him, he was already asleep, one hand resting on the pillow where her head would go, as if even in dreams. He was waiting for her. The next morning, she woke before dawn, as always. She made coffee, still too weak, but she'd stopped complaining, and packed her lunch. As she slipped on her shoes by the door, he appeared in the hallway, wrapped in his robe. "Big day?" he asked. "Just another day," she said. "But a good one." He kissed her forehead the way he always did. Be kind to yourself today, too, she smiled. Always. And as she walked out into the cool morning air, she knew, no matter what came next, no matter how the world changed, they'd already built something that couldn't be bought, sold, or taken away. A life. A home. A love that lived in small things. A shared cup of tea. A hand held in silence. A hospital that remembered to care. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.